Welcome back, everyone. Before we dive in, make sure you drop your thoughts and the lessons you took from this story in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's get into it. My wife said, "You are cooking dinner every night from now on. I am done lifting a finger." I said, "Understood." Then I called a realtor. 6 hours later, when she walked in after brunch and shopping, the kitchen was empty, and so was every closet shelf she used. That was the moment Veronica realized the rules had changed. My name is Gregory Bennett, and I am 43 years old. I have been underestimated my whole life. I manage a family chain restaurant in Mansfield, Ohio, the kind of town where everyone knows your business before you finish living it. I boxed in college back when my hands were faster than my patience. These days I save fights for when they matter, and I prefer fights I can win without leaving bruises on my knuckles. I learned that lesson the hard way. The loudest person in the room rarely controls the room. The person with the receipts does. Veronica stood in our gutted kitchen, designer heels clicking on bare linoleum, her hair still perfect from her morning appointment. She held 3 shopping bags from stores we could not afford, eyes wide with a kind of offended disbelief I had only ever seen when a waiter brought the wrong wine. She said, "Gregory, what is this?" I sat on the one remaining chair, mine, reading the newspaper like it was an ordinary Tuesday. I said, "You told me you were done lifting a finger. I believed you." Veronica's gaze snapped around the room like she expected the cabinets and pots to reappear out of shame. She said, "Where is everything? Where are my clothes?" I folded the paper slowly and set it aside, making sure my hands did not shake. I slid a small key across the empty counter and said, "Storage unit off Park Avenue. The rent is paid through next month. After that, you can decide what you want to do." She stared at the key like it might bite. Veronica said, "You cannot be serious." I said, "I am serious." She took a step closer and her voice got sharper, the way it did in public when she wanted people to hear her without having to raise it. She said, "This is my house too." I said, "It is not. I bought it 2 years before I met you. Your name is not on the deed." I lifted a manila folder from the counter and set it down carefully, as if it were fragile. "The papers have been filed." That folder changed her posture immediately. Veronica did not like surprises unless she was the one delivering them. She looked from the folder to my face as if trying to locate the joke. She said, "Divorce?" I said yes. She said, "Over one argument?" I said, "Over years." She opened her mouth, closed it, and then her tone shifted into something polished. She said, "Even if you want a divorce, you cannot just throw me out like I am nothing." I said, "You have a storage key. That is more than nothing." Veronica had never been told no for long. She was brilliant when she wanted to be. She had a law degree, a sharp memory, and a way of walking into a room like the room owed her an apology. She married me because I was stable, because I did not gamble, because I did not drink too much, because I showed up on time and did what I said I would do. In her language, that meant I was safe. A backup plan, a foundation, something you stood on while you reached for what you actually wanted. I used to tell myself that if I stayed steady, she would settle into us. I told myself that love was patience, and patience would be rewarded. Then I realized patience can also be permission. It can train someone to believe they can do anything without consequences. Veronica did not wake up one day and become cruel. She became comfortable. She became certain I would swallow whatever she served me. That afternoon, standing in the empty kitchen, she tried to laugh it off as if she could charm her way out of it. Veronica said, "Gregory, I had a long day. I was tired." I said something dramatic. "You know how I get." I said, "I know exactly how you get." She said, "So you are punishing me?" I said, "No, I'm accepting you." She blinked, confused. I said, "You said you were done. So I am done too." The first crack in her control came when I said the name. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw anything. I did not point a finger. I said, "Your boyfriend can cook for you now." The shopping bags slipped from her hands and hit the floor. She said, "My what?" I said, "Damian Carver. He owns the gym on North Main Street. He drives that red sports car with the racing stripes." Veronica's expression went through colors that did not match her outfit. She said, "I do not know what you think you know." I said, I know you have been sleeping with him for 3 months. She tried to interrupt. I kept going, still calm. I know you think I am too stupid to notice. And I know you are about to lie to my face again. She stood very still, and for a moment the room was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator used to hum, like my mind was searching for a sound that was no longer there. Veronica recovered quickly. She always did. She said, even if that were true, which it is not, you cannot just make decisions like this without talking to me. I said, we have been talking for years. You just did not listen. She said, you are being irrational. I said, I am being late. Late to the point where I should have stopped believing you. The truth was not glamorous. There was no secret investigator. There were no dramatic photographs printed on glossy paper. I followed her once. Just once. I parked across from a motel on the edge of Mansfield and watched my wife walk through the door with a man who looked like he spent more time in mirrors than in books. I sat in my truck with my hands on the steering wheel and realized something I did not want to know. Seeing it once is enough to feel it forever. Veronica sat down hard in my chair, the only chair left, and her voice softened into something that sounded almost human. She said, Gregory, please. We can fix this. We can go to counseling. I made a mistake. I said, you made choices. She said, you are making this bigger than it is. I said, you made it big the moment you started living a second life. I walked toward the front door and then stopped because a part of me wanted the truth to touch every corner that had been covered in lies. I said, and Veronica, your friend Shelby knew. She flinched. I said, she has been covering for you. She made excuses. She told me to give you space. I thought you should know who your closest friend is when she smiles. I left Veronica in that empty kitchen with her shopping bags and her disbelief, in a house that no longer belonged to her the way she thought it did. When I stepped outside, the October air hit my face like a clean slap. I stood on the porch for a second and listened to the neighborhood. A dog barked. A car passed. Somewhere a lawn sprinkler clicked. Normal sounds. Normal lives. Mine had just snapped in half, and the world did not pause to acknowledge it. I drove to a bar on 4th Street called the Black Lantern, a stubborn, dim place that served cheap beer and better silence. I sat at the counter and ordered whiskey. The bartender, Marla, watched me the way people watch storms. She was younger than me, sharp-eyed, and she had the kind of calm that comes from listening to other people's chaos without absorbing it. She said, you look like you lost something. I said, I lost the lie. 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed. The first call was Veronica. I let it ring. The second was Shelby. I let it ring. The third was Damien. That one I answered. Damien said, we need to talk. His voice was smooth, practiced, the kind of confidence that only exists when you think you are untouchable. I said, you have some nerve calling me. He said, not over the phone. Meet me at the gym in an hour. Come alone. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. A man like Damien thinks every problem is solved by choosing a location and showing dominance. He thinks the world is a locker room with better lighting. I said, you want me on your turf? He said, we can settle this like adults. He hung up. Marla poured another drink without asking. She said, that sounds like a bad idea. I said, it probably is. Marla leaned closer and said, do not let him pull you into something that makes you look like the problem. I looked at her. She said, men like that count on you reacting. They want the story to be that you lost control. You have to make the story true. I said, what story? She said, that you are calm and he is not. Torino Fitness sat in a converted building on North Main Street. All chrome and mirrors and posters of bodies that looked like sculptures. The bass from his speakers hit my chest as soon as I walked in. Damien stood near the free weights with his arms crossed, muscles filled out under a sleeveless shirt, jaw set like he was posing even when nobody asked him to. He nodded as if we were old friends. He said, Gregory. I said, Damien. I kept my distance. My hands were loose at my sides. I was not there to prove anything with my fists. Damien said, you know why you are here. I looked around the empty gym. It was empty because he wanted it empty. No witnesses. No embarrassment. I said, actually, I do not. You called me. His eyes narrowed. He said, Veronica and I are serious. What we have is real. I tasted the word real like it was spoiled. I said, "How long have you two been serious?" He said, "That is not important." I said, "It is to me. I am trying to understand when my wife decided our marriage was disposable." Damien took a step closer, using his size as punctuation. He said, "Watch your mouth." I said, "Or what?" Damien's jaw tightened. He said, "You think you're clever." I said, "I think you are obvious." He started talking like he was reading from a script. He said, "She was unhappy. You were not giving her what she needed." I said, "What she needed was honesty. What she wanted was attention. She chose you because you were easy." Damien's hands clenched. He said, "She came to me." I said, "Men who say that like it is proof of character are always the same men who will take anything offered and call it fate." He stepped again. I did not step back. I said, "You do not know anything about me." I said, "I know you go after married women because single women see what you are." That landed. I saw it in his eyes first, the flash of insecurity behind the muscle. He tried to cover it with anger. He said, "You are just bitter." I said, "Maybe, but I am also paying attention." I walked to a bench press and looked at the weight loaded. It was impressive in a childish way. I said, "This must look very convincing to someone who confuses strength with substance." Damien said, "Veronica is not confused." I said, "Veronica is expensive." That made a pause. I said, "Those shopping trips, those credit cards, that leased vehicle she treats like a throne, it is all funded by someone's paycheck. It has been mine. Now it will be yours." He said, "That is not how it works." I said, "You should check how it works." Damien's face shifted as doubt tried to crawl in. I could practically see him picturing Veronica walking through his life with a shopping bag in each hand, turning his gym profits into receipts. I said, "If you think she is low maintenance, you are in for an education." I turned toward the door. I said, "Good luck." That was when he swung. It was not a clean punch. It was anger dressed up as masculinity. I saw it coming early. I ducked, stepped in, and drove my elbow into his midsection with controlled force, enough to stop him, not enough to turn it into a war. Damien folded to his knees, gasping. I stood over him and said, "Technique is not a rumor." I walked out before the moment could become a story where I was the aggressor. I drove to Shelby Patterson's house. Shelby lived in one of those neighborhoods where lawns were perfect and everything looked designed for photographs, not living. I parked across the street and watched her through the window, pacing with her phone pressed to her ear. I did not need imagination to guess who she was talking to. Shelby opened the door before I knocked, like she had been expecting consequences. Shelby said, "Gregory." Her smile looked painful. I walked past her into the beige living room without asking. I said, "We need to talk." She said, "If this is about Veronica," I said, "it is about you." Her face tightened. She said, "I do not know what you mean." I said, "You do. How long have you been covering for her?" Shelby tried the innocent approach first. She said, "Gregory, please do not do this." I said, "Last month I asked where Veronica was. You told me she was here. You said you were having a girls' night." Shelby swallowed. She did not deny it. She tried to justify it. She said, "I was trying to protect her." I said, "Protect her from what?" "Consequences." Shelby's eyes flashed. She said, "She was miserable. She felt trapped." I laughed once, short and dry. I said, "Trapped in a house with a husband who paid the bills and came home every night." Shelby said, "You gave her things. You did not give her passion." I said, "So you helped her find passion in someone else's arms, and you call that friendship?" I looked at Shelby's framed family photos on the mantel. Her husband, their daughter smiling like a commercial. I said, "Does your husband know about your secrets?" Shelby stiffened. I said, "You have your own, do you not?" Her breathing changed. That was my confirmation. Shelby whispered, "Do not." I said, "I am not here to destroy your life. You did not need my help. You were already doing it." Shelby's eyes filled. She said, "What do you want?" I said, "The truth. When did it start? How did they meet? What did you do to help it?" Shelby sat down slowly like her legs had given up. She said, "They met at my birthday party. I invited people from the gym. Veronica was complaining about you, about her life, about feeling invisible." I said, "And you encouraged it." Shelby said, I did not discourage it. She sounded small now. She's my friend. I wanted her happy. I leaned forward. I said, you wanted excitement. You wanted to be part of something that felt dramatic. Shelby started crying. She said she was going to leave you anyway. I thought if she had someone else, she would finally do it. I said, so you helped her lie to my face while she planned to step out of my life. Shelby did not answer. I stood up. I said, you're going to make a choice tonight. You're going to tell your husband the truth about what you have been doing in your own life, or you're going to keep living in your own fiction until it collapses. Shelby said, I cannot. I said, you can. You just do not want to pay the cost. I left her in that beige room with her perfect photos and her imperfect reality. On the drive home, I did not feel satisfaction. I felt something colder, clarity. When you stop pretending, you can finally see what you are dealing with. The next morning, my lawyer called. Her name was Evelyn Harper, and she had been handling divorces in Richland County for decades. Her voice always sounded like a judge's gavel. She said, good news and bad news. I said, bad news first. Evelyn said, Veronica hired a lawyer in Columbus. He filed to contest the divorce. He is asking for temporary spousal support and a claim on the increased value of your home. I said, her name is not on the deed. Evelyn said, that does not mean she cannot claim the value of improvements made during the marriage. I pictured the kitchen renovation I paid for, the deck I built, the basement I finished with my own hands. Evelyn said, good news is her lawyer is reaching. If he had a strong case, he would be asking for everything. Evelyn paused, then said one more thing. They're asking about your finances. They're looking for hidden assets. I said, I do not have hidden assets. Evelyn said, I believe you, but she might not. Do not do anything that looks like retaliation. Document everything. Save messages. Stay calm. I went to work and tried to pretend my restaurant was not the only steady thing left. Bennett Family Dining sat on West 4th Street, established decades before me, the kind of place that served meatloaf and mashed potatoes and survived because it did not pretend to be anything else. I had managed it for years, turning it profitable when half the block was empty storefronts. I used to think steady work was enough to hold a marriage. I learned it is only enough if both people respect it. Around noon, a message came from an unknown number. We need to talk. Meet me at the Sunrise Diner on U.S. Route 30 at noon. Come alone. Signed D. Damien. I stared at the screen, then typed back, bring your insurance information. I did not add a smiley face. The Sunrise Diner was chrome and neon and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Damien sat in a back booth like he was afraid someone would recognize him without the gym lights and music. In daylight, he looked less like a threat and more like a man trying to act like a threat. I slid into the booth and ordered coffee. Damien said, I want to make you a deal. I said, that is interesting because I do not want anything from you. He said, name a price. I will pay you to walk away clean. House, divorce, everything. I stared at him. I said, you want to buy me off? He said, I want to make this easy. Veronica and I are serious. I'll let silence do the work. Damien fidgeted. He looked like a man used to getting what he wanted by being loud. I said, how much? He said, 50,000 cash. I said, that is a lot of money for someone who claims this is about love. Damien's eyes hardened. He said, everything is about money. I nodded like I agreed. Then I said, here is the problem. You think the only cost is money. You do not understand reputation. You do not understand community. You think you can simply replace one life with another like changing a shirt. Damien said, you are bitter. I said, maybe, but bitterness has never made me wrong. Damien pressed again. He said, take the money. Start over somewhere else. I looked at him and said, you should start saving it for her. He said, for what? I said, for everything she will want as soon as the excitement fades. Damien's gaze flickered. He did not like hearing that. I stood up, left a bill on the table, and said, keep your money. I walked out without looking back. My hands were steady. That was the first time I realized how much power calm can carry. In Mansfield, news is not delivered. It leaks. By Thursday morning, everyone knew about the divorce and the affair. They also knew a version of a gym confrontation that had grown in the telling. Some people said I assaulted Damien. Some said Damien threatened me. Some said Veronica cried in the street like a movie. Small towns build stories the way children build snowmen, with whatever is nearby, regardless of accuracy. I was restocking the salad bar when my friend Ethan Brooks walked in. Ethan owned a plumbing business and coached youth baseball. He had been the kind of friend you could count on until he believed rumors. He stood by the counter looking uncomfortable and said, "Gregory, we need to talk." I said, "Go ahead." Ethan said, "People are saying you threatened her. They are saying you threw her out with nothing." I stared at him. I said, "Who told you that?" Ethan said, "Does it matter?" I said, "It matters if you are going to repeat it." Ethan leaned forward. He said, "My wife is getting calls from people worried about Veronica." I felt something cold settle behind my ribs. I said, "Your wife believes her." Ethan said, "She believes something is not right." I said, "So now I am the villain." Ethan said, "People do not understand why you handled it like this." I said, "I handled it like a man who finally stopped negotiating with disrespect." Ethan's voice tightened. He said, "Maybe your marriage had problems you are not seeing." I stood up, and the room went quiet the way it always does when adults sense conflict. I said, "Get out." Ethan's eyes widened. I said, "Get out of my restaurant." Ethan stood, jaw clenched, and said, "This is what people mean. You cannot handle anyone questioning you." After he left, the restaurant felt heavier. The lunch crowd was smaller than usual. People avoided eye contact like my divorce might be contagious. While locked up that evening, Marla was outside by my truck like she had been waiting. She said, "Rough day." I said, "Word travels." She said, "That is why you cannot lose control. Right now, Veronica is controlling the narrative. She is playing the victim. People love a victim." I said, "So what do I do?" Marla said, "You tell the truth without making yourself look dangerous. You keep your voice steady. You let the facts do what yelling cannot." I looked at her and said, "This town already decided who I am." Marla said, "Then make them regret deciding too quickly." Friday night at the Black Lantern should have been noisy. Instead, it felt like a stage before the curtain rises. Conversations lowered when I walked in. People watched me like they were waiting for me to prove their assumptions. Marla poured my usual. She said, "Do not do anything stupid." I said, "Define stupid." She said, "Anything that ends with flashing lights." The door opened and Damien walked in, cleaned up, confident in a way that looked practiced. Behind him came Veronica, dressed like she wanted the room to understand she had not lost anything. The bar went quiet. They chose a corner table like they were claiming territory. Veronica kept glancing in my direction, hoping for a reaction. Damien kept his shoulders squared like he expected applause. A few minutes later, Shelby arrived, nervous, eyes darting around like she expected the floor to collapse. I finished my drink and walked to their table. I said, "Evening." Veronica's face tightened. She said, "Gregory, please do not." I pulled out an empty chair and sat without asking. I said, "Relax. I'm only here to congratulate you." Damien started to stand. I lifted a hand and said, "Do not." I smiled polite. I said, "Damien, thank you for taking over the job I have been doing." Veronica said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "The bills." Veronica's cheeks flushed. Damien's brow furrowed. I continued calm. "Now that you are together, you get the shopping, the car payments, the credit cards, everything." Veronica hissed, "That is private." I said, "It was private. Now it is part of a divorce." I turned to Damien and said, "I hope your gym does well. You will need it." Damien's eyes narrowed. He said, "I can take care of her." I said, "I am sure you believe that." Shelby spoke up, voice thin. She said, "You are trying to sabotage them." I looked at Shelby and said, "I am sharing information. If that feels like sabotage, ask yourself why." Shelby flinched as if the words slapped her. Veronica's nails dug into the table edge. Damien's jaw worked like he was chewing anger. The tension finally snapped the way tension always does when pride feels watched. Damien rose, came after me at the bar, grabbed my arm, and said, "We are not finished." The room turned toward us like a single creature. Everyone wanted a show. I looked at his hand on my arm and said, "If you hit me, do it where everyone can see. That way the truth has witnesses." Veronica rushed over, grabbing Damien's other arm. She said, "Stop. You're making a scene." Damien said he started it. I said, "I started nothing. I spoke." Damien swung at me anyway. I did not duck this time. I stepped back. His fist slammed into a brick pillar beside me. The sound of bone breaking cut through the room like a crack of wood in a fire. Damien screamed and clutched his hand. Blood seeped between his fingers. Marla was already calling for help. People pressed closer, not to help, but to witness. Veronica panicked, voice high. She said, "What did you do?" Damien gasped. He moved. I said, calm as ever, "Someone should call an ambulance." I picked up my jacket and walked out while the room buzzed behind me. The story already rewriting itself into something nobody could ignore. Damien attacked. Damien missed. Damien paid. The emergency room in Mansfield was bright, sterile, and impatient. A police officer took my statement because Damien's lawyer would surely try to turn this into a narrative where I had threatened him. The officer, Patricia Hines, listened with tired eyes and wrote notes. She said, "So he attacked you and you did not hit him?" I said, "Correct." She said, "Witnesses say the same." She looked at me and said, "Small towns remember." I said, "I know." When I walked out, Veronica was waiting outside the hospital entrance like she had been pacing for hours. Her face looked different up close, strain around the eyes, makeup no longer perfect. She said, "We need to talk." I said, "We do not." She said, "5 minutes." I said, 5. Veronica wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. She said, "This has to stop." I said, "What has to stop?" She said, "The way you are turning everyone against us." I stared at her. I said, "I did not turn anyone." I stopped covering. Veronica's eyes filled. She said, "I did not mean for any of this to happen." I said, "Affairs do not happen by accident. They happen by decision." Veronica's voice dropped. She said, "I was lonely." I said, "Then you should have told me. You should have left honestly. You should not have lied and used me as the floor under your second life." She said, "I made a mistake." I said, "You made a pattern." She looked down and whispered, "I do not even love him." That stopped me. For a second, I saw the marriage I thought I had. The moments I used to believe were real. Then I remembered the motel and the lies and the way she spoke to me like I was staff. I said, "Then why are you here defending him?" Veronica swallowed hard. She said, "Because I do not know how to fix what I broke." I said, "You cannot fix it. Some things break and become truth." I left her in the parking lot, alone in her expensive coat, and drove home. My house felt empty, but also felt clean, like someone had finally opened a window. I poured a drink and sat in silence that belonged to me. The next morning, Paul Patterson showed up at my fence gate. Paul was Shelby's husband, a dentist who worked too hard and spoke too gently for the life he had been handed. His eyes looked raw. He said, "Shelby told me." I let him sit on my porch. He stared at my yard and said, 2 years. His voice cracked. "She has been seeing someone at the country club." I did not pretend shock. Paul did not need theater. He needed reality. He said, "She wants to fix it." I said, "What do you want?" Paul laughed once, bitter and soft. He said, "I want last week back." Then he stood, shoulders slumped, and said, "Thank you for forcing the truth out." He left like a man carrying a heavy box with no handles. An hour later, Evelyn Harper called and said, "Veronica's lawyer wants to settle." She sounded surprised, which meant it was unusual. Evelyn said, "No spousal support. No claim on the house. Clean divorce." I stared out the window on my driveway. It was exactly what I wanted, and it felt like a trap because it came too easily. Evelyn added, "They mentioned she may leave Ohio, possibly California." That afternoon, Marla found me at the restaurant and said, "You got the settlement offer." I said, "Yes." She said, "Are you taking it?" I said, "I do not know." Marla's gaze narrowed. She said, "You have been building to something, and now she wants to bow out before she faces it." I drove past Damien's gym. It was closed. A handwritten sign said the owner was recovering from an injury. I drove past Veronica's rental house. Her car sat in the driveway. Lights off, curtains closed. It looked like a place where people hide from consequences. I realized then that whatever revenge I thought I wanted was really just a desire to feel like I had control again. But control is not the same as healing. Sunday morning, I called Evelyn and told her to accept the settlement. Evelyn said, "Smart." The word smart felt strange. I did not feel smart. I felt tired. I spent the day doing inventory at the restaurant, normal work, steady work, reminding myself I still had a life that existed outside betrayal. Ethan Brooks came back. He looked embarrassed, holding his pride like a burden. He said, "My wife did some digging. Veronica's story has holes." I did not gloat. I just nodded. Ethan said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "Do not be loyal to the loudest voice. Be loyal to the person you actually know." Ethan swallowed and said, "I was wrong." That afternoon, Damien called again. He said, "Meet me at the gym." I almost said no. Then curiosity won. When I arrived, the gym felt smaller in silence. Damien sat on a bench, his hand in a cast, his confidence deflated. He said, "She is leaving." I said, "Veronica?" Damien nodded. "California. She asked me to come." I studied him. I said, "Are you going?" He said, "I do not know." I said, "You should ask yourself if she would stay for you if the roles were reversed." Damien's eyes flickered. He said, "Why are you doing this?" I said, "Because you keep acting like you won something." You did not. You bought into a story. I turned to leave. Damien said, "Do you think she ever loved me?" I paused at the door. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I said, "Ask her. Watch her face when she answers." Then I walked out and left him alone with the mirrors and the truth he had been avoiding. Weeks passed. The divorce moved fast once the settlement was accepted. Veronica left Mansfield quietly, like someone slipping out of a party before the host can ask questions. I did not see her go. Marla told me Veronica came into the Black Lantern one last time looking for me. Marla said, "She looked smaller, like she had been carrying something heavy and finally realized it was her own." Damien's gym never reopened. People whispered that he sold equipment to pay debts and took a job at a factory outside town. I saw him once at the grocery store, his hands still in a cast, eyes down. He pretended not to see me. I let him have that. Paul Patterson filed for divorce. Shelby moved back in with her parents, and the neighborhood stopped pretending their lives were perfect. My restaurant recovered. Customers returned once the scandal cooled and a new one took its place. Mansfield always moves on. It does not heal. It replaces. Ethan and I repaired our friendship, but felt different, older, more cautious. I learned that trust is not only between spouses. It is between everyone who claims to know you. In December, Evelyn called and said, "It is final." I thanked her and hung up. I stood in my living room and listened to the house. The silence was still there, but it no longer felt like punishment. It felt like space. I spent Christmas with Ethan and his family, eating too much, watching football, pretending I did not notice the empty seat inside me. On New Year's Eve, I worked late, serving couples who toasted to another year, families who believed in their own stability the way I used to. After midnight, I locked up and drove home through streets lit by distant fireworks. I poured a drink, good whiskey, the kind Veronica used to call a waste, and sat in my living room without music. 6 months later, a postcard arrived from Los Angeles. No return address. I recognized the handwriting. On the front was a picture of the Hollywood sign. On the back were 4 words, "I am sorry. Be well." I read it once, then threw it away. Some chapters are not meant to be reopened. My name is Gregory Bennett. I am 44 years old now. I run a small restaurant in Mansfield, Ohio. It is not the life I imagined when I stood at an altar and believed vows could hold anything together. But it is the life I earned when I finally stopped negotiating with disrespect and started choosing myself. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story drop.